Welcome to the Lentil Intervention Podcast, talking all things movement, whole food nutrition and environmental wellness with your hosts, Ben and Emma.
Hello everybody, my name is Ben Adelberg.
And I'm Emma Strutt.
And welcome to episode 18 for the year. Firstly, please go straight back into your podcast app and make sure you are subscribed to this podcast. Also, if you are enjoying our content and finding it useful, please consider buying us a coffee. Details in our show notes and website. Right, if you have very recently visited our website, you'll notice under the Team tab, we have a new organisation added to our network of partners, Evidence-Based Eating New Zealand.
So Evidence-Based Eating New Zealand are raising awareness of whole food, plant-based nutrition benefits in New Zealand by educating and inspiring the general public, health professionals, private organisations and government institutions using evidence-based research.
So this year they are delivering a series of health-focused public lectures highlighting the power of plant-based whole foods to restore health to all New Zealanders. The locations are Christchurch, which is just passed, Dunedin, Wellington and Auckland, and you can find all the details on their website, which is linked in our show notes and website. These seminars are emceed by a past guest of ours from Season 1, Grant Dixon, who is the Evidence-Based Eating New Zealand chairman, and we will have him on the show very soon to tell us more about it.
So on the 22nd of May, Evidence-Based Eating kicked things off in Christchurch with their first event. This seminar focused on our GP Frontline. So today we bring you Professor Julia Rucklidge. Julia is a professor of clinical psychology in the School of Psychology, Speech and Hearing at the University of Canterbury. She is also the co-author of the book The Better Brain. In this lecture, Professor Rucklidge discusses the foods and nutrients for optimal brain health. And as a reminder, if you like what you hear, please check out the EBE website to see their upcoming events.
So I'm just going to give a sort of a bit of a brief overview of the area, the interface between mental health and nutrition, and then go into a little bit of detail about some specific studies. So just to give a disclaimer, I actually never talk and name formulas. They are listed in the book, all the different formulas that have been studied, the ones in my lab as well as ones overseas. But I study the idea that nutrition is relevant to the brain, and the only way you can really do that with double-blind control trials is by doing it with capsules of minerals and vitamins. So that's what I've been doing over the last 15 years. But I certainly don't make any money out of it, and I don't receive any money or funding from the companies that make the products that I've been studying. And that's really important to have that arm's length away from the people who make the products. And also a disclaimer that I'm going to talk about nutrition, but we know that if we could address poverty in our society, or that we could reduce the amount of trauma that people are exposed to, then we would go a long way towards reducing the number of people who are struggling with a mental health issue. So you probably don't need to be told about the scale of the problem. Here's the South Island where you guys are all sitting there. And the population of the South Island is about 1 million people. It's a fifth of the population. And that's the number of people who are struggling with a mental health issue in any one given year. We know the numbers are going up. This is just based on New Zealand data, New Zealand Health Survey. We see an increase in the number of people with a mood disorder. From 2006 to 2018, an increase of 47%, an increase of 160% in the number of people who would meet criteria for an anxiety disorder. About 5% of the population are in the severe range, 9% moderate, and 7% mild. But I would say there's a lot more people who are just struggling subclinically with a whole host of psychiatric or psychological symptoms. And then we know that this has been addressed by giving medications. And if we look at the data on antidepressants, that's gone up by 48% over a decade. And the rise in the use of antipsychotics has gone up by 40% over a decade, from 2007 to 2016. So we're trying to address this problem with medications. Primarily, if you're lucky, you might get psychotherapy. But at the end of the day, I think it's fair to say that we have a problem of epidemic proportions, an increasing number of people being identified with a mental health problem, Conventional treatments are simply not helping and reaching enough people. And if they were, I think the rates should be going down. Certainly, medications have saved lots of people's lives, but far too many people are still suffering. And those are the ones that I hear about. And Grant mentioned my TEDx talk. It's actually 1.8 million now, and I get thousands of emails and calls over the years, and I can attest to you that there are people out there who are on many medications, doing their best. Their doctors are doing their best, and yet they are still struggling. And the report that went to the government 3 years ago, we can't medicate or treat our way out of the epidemic of mental distress. So what else can we do? I think that we need to really, as Grant already talked about his own personal story, we need to be looking at what we're putting in our mouths. And really, when it comes to the work that I do, I think about the brain. Although it's only 2% of our body weight, it consumes 20 to 40% of the glucose and nutrients that come directly from our food. I like to call it the hungriest organ. And so our education around food is often about muscles or heart or bones. We never, very, very rarely have been talking about the brain and the nutritional requirements of the brain. And I hope to convince you over the next 20 minutes or so why you should care. So I like to call this the biggest social experiment of all time. We've been eating these foods for about 100 years, plus or minus, and we've seen an increase in the chronic diseases, diabetes, heart disease, obesity, and mental health issues. This is not a coincidence. There's some really robust data that show that this type of eating has been detrimental to our health. We've been changing the foods that we eat from whole foods to processed foods, which overall is not necessarily a bad thing. Processed could include canning foods or freezing food, and that can retain the nutrient quality of that particular food, like your peas or your vegetables. But really, the biggest problem is the ultra processed food that people are consuming. You'd think that you could argue that not a lot of us are consuming ultra processed food. You just have to look at the data and see that 48% of the caloric intake of Canadians is ultra processed, 61% of Americans, and 69% of packaged foods that are sold in supermarkets in New Zealand are considered ultra processed. So it's rampant, it's everywhere, and half of the calories that people are consuming come from ultra processed food. I suspect perhaps less in this audience, given you're interested, but we need to really pay attention to this at a population level because it's killing us. What happens when we eliminate half the nutrients in the diet, which is essentially what's happening when half of your caloric intake is coming from ultra-processed food? We already know this from Ansel Keys in the 1950s, based on the starvation experiments. I certainly wouldn't recommend replicating this. They took what were considered 36 normal, healthy men, and they were exposed to 6 months of nutrient deprivation, and they reduced their caloric intake by about 50%. And what they found was that these people experienced a lot of psychological symptoms: depression, hysteria, irritability, self-mutilation, apathy, lethargy, social withdrawal, and inability to concentrate. These are all symptoms that we're very familiar with. They're the ones that are often associated with psychological problems. So it's not a mystery that food can seriously impact on our mental health. And yet my training in clinical psychology, and I suspect the training of any of my medical colleagues in the audience, would be that you weren't given a lot of information about the importance of nutrition for the brain. It was viewed as irrelevant to psychological problems when I was training, and it still is really not talked a lot about. It is increasing in our clinical psychology program at Canterbury, but it's not something that we seem to get educated about. And that means that we don't share that information with our patients, and therefore they won't be exposed to the enormous amount of research that's being done in this area. So one obvious solution, though, is that we should just tell everyone to eat better. And what does that mean? I think there's a lot of debate around that. But what I can share with you is the epidemiological studies that have been done around the world, in Australia, in Spain, in the UK, in Japan, and they're all sort of showing this a whole food diet. And it is difficult to sort of quantify and say what a dietary pattern looks like. But when they they sort of identify that people who are following a whole food, often a Mediterranean style diet, but not always, sometimes it's local to their area, is that when you're eating foods that are high in fruits and vegetables, your fish, your healthy fats, low in your takeaways, then that is associated with a reduction of mental health illness, depression, and anxiety. And the more we consume foods that are consistent with a Western type of diet, the greater our risk for mental health issues. And this is not just based on cross-sectional data, where you might indicate or think that people who are depressed, naturally, they're going to eat more poorly. It's also based on longitudinal data, where they follow people over time and they look at their diet over time and they look at their psychological symptoms over time, and they find that what you're eating at time 1 predicts your mental health at time 2, and those are up to 5. Those studies are up to 5 years. So it's certainly a risk factor. It's not everything. It doesn't explain all mental health issues, but it certainly seems to be a pretty robust one that we need to pay attention to. So what does it mean to eat better? When the public thinks about the content of food, what do you think they think about? So I've spent a lot of time thinking about food labels, and to try to better understand the messages that are coming out from when you're walking around the supermarket. What are we being told by the food industry? And I've come to the conclusion that we focus the most on the macronutrients, and that's your carbs, your proteins, and your fats. And if you look at any food label, you'll see that they'll tell you about your saturated fat content, your calorie content. It'll tell you about your carb content of that specific type of food. But what is completely almost missing, not entirely, but virtually missing, is the micronutrient content of that food. But you might think about calories, and we've spent decades counting calories to no avail. We've just gotten fatter. So that's clearly not the way forward. And if you think about it from just a calorie perspective, the Big Mac is going to be the same calorie quantity as a falafel salad. And hopefully we all know that the falafel salad is going to be better for us nutritionally. But if you're someone who's being told about just counting your calories and making sure you hit about that 2,000, 2,500 calories per day, then you might make different choices. So here's some of those food labels, and looking at the nutritional facts, you can see that the information that they're shared with the most is about these calories and these macronutrients. Sometimes you might see a few micronutrients mentioned there, and you'll see that these ones that I've found on food packages have very few micronutrients. So vitamin D in this one there's no vitamin D. I don't know why they bother listing that, or calcium, 2%. So you're not getting a lot of information. Even something that's rich in micronutrients, they won't tell you on the package, because that's not what's required for packaging. So even something like, if you happen to have a package for something that was healthier, maybe some nuts, you still won't learn how much there is in there in terms of micronutrient content, like your selenium or your magnesium. It's just simply not there. We've developed in New Zealand this traffic light system. I hate them for the most part. Sorry to those who you think these are being really wonderful. I think for the most part, they help you choose a better ultra-processed food over another one. That's not entirely true, because there are some really healthy options that have got these health star ratings. Often they do more poorly than the really ultra-processed food. That's because of the focus of the healthy star ratings. It's on energies. If you're low in energy, low in calories, low in saturated fats, low in sugar, low in sodium, and you have one nutrient, then you're going to get 5 stars. So if it was fortified with iron, it would get 5 stars if it was low on those other things. And like I like to say, is that a cardboard box would get 4-star rating, but that doesn't mean you should eat it. It is a real concern that things that, like a cardboard box or anything inanimate, would get such a high star rating, and that's based on the fact that it's about what's not in the food rather than what is in the food. And so I think we really need to be focusing more on what's in your food rather than what's not in it. So many people won't tell you or think about, therefore, about the micronutrient adequacy of food. And there's nothing in the food labels that are going to tell you about whether or not it's good for your brain. So I want to switch to thinking about micronutrients. This is the cover of my book, The Better Brain. And what are they? They're vitamins and minerals. They're required in small amounts for the most part, although there are some macronutrients, like calcium, because we consume that in a much higher dose relative to other micronutrients, like say you take a very small dose of say B12, for example. Essential for production of enzymes, hormones, neurotransmitters. And why do we need them? They're the building blocks of our brain. Our mitochondria need them for energy production. If you look at the Krebs cycle, along all the pathways for making all of those chemicals that eventually will produce ATP, you need micronutrients. They're identified as cofactors all the way along. And it's not one special micronutrient, it's the full array. When we think about the manufacture of neurotransmitters, I'll show you a slide soon, but we need to understand that to make serotonin or dopamine, all these really important neurotransmitters are important for emotion regulation or for concentration. You need micronutrients in order to manufacture them. And for regulation of DNA and keeping our DNA healthy, we need micronutrients. Also, other things that are important that they do is, eliminating toxins, that if you got exposed to a lot of toxins in our environment, like your plastics or your other toxins, you need the detoxification pathway requires nutrients. So just looking at brain metabolism specifically, the transformation of one compound to another, chemical A to chemical B, you need an enzyme and you need cofactors. And so that could be tryptophan to serotonin. You'll have an enzyme that's important for that, but you'd need those cofactors and no special nutrient. That's really, really important. We are so focused on just that magic bullet, that just take more vitamin D and you'll feel better, or just take zinc. I think that's, when you think about brain metabolism, you recognize really quickly that that's the wrong way to think about it. So if we look at the pathways, a small portion of the pathways to make serotonin, you can see that there's a whole host of different nutrients that are required. And then I ask you whether or not we can get those nutrients out of ultra-processed food, and hopefully you know the answer to that. So nutrient density and variety of food is going to be essential. There's now research that's been done where people have been, where they've been enrolled in research where they get randomized to either a Mediterranean style diet versus a control group, which has been social support. And the Mediterranean style diet does consist of a little bit of meat in there and a little bit of certainly some portions of fish, but mostly it's high in your legumes, your fruits and vegetables. And what they found was that there was far greater reduction of the number of people who were struggling with major depression. They had to be depressed to get into the study. They had to have a poor diet to get into the study. And they showed a very large group different effect size of 1.16. Number needed to treat for remission was 4.1. And here's just the data looking at the reduction in their depression scores in the diet intervention versus social support. 32% of those on the diet intervention went into remission in their depression compared to 8% in the control group. The great thing about this study is that it has now been replicated twice in other centers in Australia. And so we can feel pretty confident that a change in your diet can have a very, very positive effect on your mental health status. And there's just what they were using in that study in terms of the recommendations, what they were trying to increase the consumption of in these people, specifically the olive oils, the grains, the dairy, nuts, increasing your legumes. As I said, there was a little bit of red meat, some servings of fish, poultry, eggs, and a little bit of opportunity for some extras, some dark chocolate, those types of things. So most of the data when it comes to mental health, and I really want to emphasize that I'm not talking about physical health here, has been around the Mediterranean diet. And that does seem to be a really good recommendation for people who are struggling with mental health issues, is to first look at reducing their consumption of ultra-processed food and increase their consumption of whole, real food. But even if we do manage to get the public to eat more nutrient-dense food, is that enough? And so there's some reasons why I think we need to be concerned about our food supply. We choose foods that are rich in, that grow quickly, that transport well, that don't bruise, that look pretty, but we're not choosing foods necessarily for their nutrient content. And there's a lot of data across the world that's suggesting that the nutrient density of our food has been decreasing. That might partly be because as well of the poor remineralization of our soils. We know that there are specific nutrients that are depleted in soils in New Zealand, like iodine and selenium, but we also only seem to put back PK and N back into the soil. And so some, more local, the local farmers may be doing more in terms of repleting other trace minerals. We're putting glyphosate on our crops, and that can be considered a mineral chelator, which has been shown to reduce the nutrient density of our food. And with the increase in carbon dioxide in the planet, that actually also has a detrimental negative side effect of plants growing more quickly, which I guess is a good thing. But the downside of that is that the plant then doesn't have the sufficient amount of time to take the minerals up through in the soil into the plant. And so they can be deprived of the full array of nutrients. These are some data from Canada, looking at the number of 40 different fields in Canada, where they looked at the nutrient density of nutrient quality of the soils. And this is the percentage of those fields in which the nutrient was above the lowest level of the ideal range. And so what you can see here is that magnesium is the only one that seems to be sufficient across all of those fields. And you can see that there's huge deficiency in many of the fields in things like manganese and copper, zinc, boron, etc. So we do need to be concerned about this problem of the nutrient quality of our soils. So under what conditions might you need more nutrients than what you can get out of your food? So eating food first is my message. Changing from that ultra-processed diet to eating more of your whole, real foods. But for some people, that's not sufficient, who are really struggling with some serious mental health issues. And that could be because of genetic differences, that some people are simply more vulnerable. They don't code as well for certain enzymes that are important for, say, your methylation cycle or the Krebs cycle, and that will influence the metabolic processes and will slow them down and make them more sluggish. As we age, unfortunately, we're less able to absorb the nutrients that we do get out of our food. Medications that people take, like statins or antidepressants, have been shown to have an effect on nutrients in terms of nutrient depletion. Inflammation can have a huge effect on our nutrient supply. I can't see that one because of my pictures in the way. Sorry. Oh, yes, pregnancy. There are certain stages of life where obviously our nutritional needs are much higher. Pregnancy, I would also say adolescence. I have two of them, and I always like to think about it as brain is under reconstruction, and that they need a lot more nutrients as they grow and the frontal lobes are developing. I've already talked about the exposure to toxins. Our gut health is really key in terms of it will influence how much we absorb if we've got a really unhealthy, inflamed gut. And then finally, I want to focus on stress, because I suspect many of us are experiencing this. And I do have some specific data that I want to talk about. In terms of stress, do any of these things apply? Financial stress or overload at work, or your family, medical issues stressing you out, climate change, the effect of that, of just that worry about what's happening in the future, traffic woes. And then the coronavirus, that has really had a huge impact on people's stress. And what's been interesting about coming to the UK for the last 2 years is that it is constantly on my mind. And what I think that people have had to experience in places like this is that constant vigilance. And that, for me, is very similar to the constant vigilance that we all experienced in Christchurch following the Christchurch earthquakes. So I think there's some relevance there. And also that would mean that there may be some relevance on the research that I conducted in Christchurch that I'll share with you. So all of these factors could result in fewer nutrients being available for brain health. So to talk about some specific data here is that there's a wealth of data that a lot of people aren't familiar with, showing that B vitamins, specifically supplementing with B vitamins, is helpful for reduction of stress. This has been done mostly in the workplace or with students, but they're placebo-controlled trials. It's a small effect, but then these people aren't super stressed. They're not clinically stressed. They're just feeling a little bit more anxious because of what's going on in their environment. When you couple that knowledge with the fact that when you are you're exposed to a natural disaster like an earthquake, we make very poor food choices. And so that led me to think that we should be supplementing with micronutrients following a major stressor could be beneficial. So you'll all remember the Christchurch earthquakes of 2010, 2011. There was then another environmental disaster that I've studied, which was following a flood in Calgary, Alberta in 2013. And then, of course, the devastation of March 15th, 2019, when a gunman came and killed 51 people and injured 40 others in 2 mosques in Christchurch. So what I've done here is I've just compiled some information that we got from those 3 events and some data. For the third one, it was we didn't do any research with the mosque victims, in that I'm a white woman not connected with the Muslim community. It was not appropriate for me to do any research then, but we did some clinical observations where we raised money and we donated nutrients to anybody who was interested in taking them, and we monitored them clinically over time. So I'm just going to share these data with you. So what I've shown you here is looking at this in respect to moderate stress, like how stressed people were when they were first before they started taking micronutrients in pill form, and we're looking at stress. And I'm just going to go through different studies with you. So this is the earthquake, and we were able to reduce, based on people taking broad spectrum micronutrients, reduce their stress from the moderate range on average to the normal stress range. So they were no longer clinically elevated. This is following that flood where we showed exactly the same thing. That's a beautiful replication. Here's the clinical observation following the mosque shooting. And just know that I did everything I could have to get these funded through the public healthcare system. I sent data to the local GPs, to the mayor, to the the science advisors, the Minister of Health. It wasn't that I was silent about this, but we just couldn't get them to consider this as an option. And instead, I'll share what happened to them. So at earthquake comparator, we had people who chose not to take micronutrients. So it's not just this feel-good effect of being in a clinical trial. We monitored these people and there was no change in their symptoms. And in the flood, we had a vitamin D comparator where they stayed still in the clinically elevated range. There's the line indicating that. So we have 3 replications. And in terms of number of people who said they felt a lot better, like much to very much improved, this shows you that the broad spectrum, the vitamins and minerals in combination, are better than B complex, which was our comparator, which I remember has been shown to be better than placebo. And that about 40% of them saw themselves as much to very much improved, compared to 20% of B complex and 10% of those who were treatment as usual. In the flood study, it was up to 50% of those broad spectrum, 40% B complex, and just under 20% for vitamin D alone. And then we have this just looked at broad spectrum following the massacre, and you see a really high percentage, over 50% of those were reporting to be much to very much improved. So really simple treatment that has broad reach. And in terms of trauma, we looked at probable PTSD, and that reduced from 65% down to 19% with those who were given the micronutrients in the earthquake. Our treatment as usual, there was no change. You can see that it stayed about 48%. And then with the mosque shooting, we also had that massive reduction relative to the earthquake. So 77% down to about 23%. So trauma rates of symptoms associated with PTSD also decreased over a short period of time. And here's just one person who spoke to the press about his experience. Mirwais Waziri. I started taking the nutrients about 2 months after the attack. After a week, I was sleeping for 6 or 7 hours a night. My appetite came back. I was happier and much more energetic. And I'm still not 100%, but I am much better than I was before. And as I said in my TEDx talk, and this was 7 years ago, a well-nourished body and brain is better able to withstand ongoing stress and recover from mental illness. Giving micronutrients in appropriate doses can be an effective and inexpensive public health intervention to improve the mental health of a population following an environmental catastrophe. So I just wonder whether or not our resilience is lower due to our poor nutrient intake. So a better future I see for mental health is that we really address the dietary issues. It's just the elephant in the room. We need to be if I could have a magic wand, and the number one thing that I would ask for is that we just get rid of ultra processed food from our supermarkets, from the schools, so that our children are just simply not given that as a choice, because it's not a food choice. It's nutrient depleted. That we obviously need to do other things like teach our children how to cook and exercise and be socially connected, and then consider micronutrient supplementation when these other interventions don't work. Randomized trials in the 1600s showed that putting limes aboard ships headed out for long voyages completely eliminated the 40% mortality from scurvy. So there's the Better Brain. It's out now. I was hoping to, if people wanted to get signed copies, that I would do that. There's also an online course for people who want to know more about this research, and the interface between mental health and nutrition is a MOOC, a mass online open access course. So if you want to know about the nutrients we've studied, then email my lab, mentalhealthnutrition@canterbury.ac.nz. And then thanks to all the funders.
Can you just tell us what micronutrients in vegetables and fruits, or what fruits and vegetables would help our micronutrients the most?
Yes. Okay. So I had this wonderful slide that I took out because I felt I was overdoing it. And I did. I went over anyway. But it shows the micronutrient content of fruits and vegetables compared to ultra processed food. There's no one, like, it's not like there's a super vegetable out there. I mean, I know that if you look at something like kale or you look at lentils, they're really elevated in your nutrient content across there's about 30 vitamins and minerals that we should be consuming as essential. But there isn't that one magic fruit or vegetable that is going to have the full array of those nutrients that if you just ate that, then you're going to be fine. You need to get the full array. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you for listening to the Lentil Intervention podcast. If you found this interesting, make sure you subscribe and share it with your friends.